The new neighbor thought it was just an old house with drawn curtains and a private owner, but late at night, he saw something move behind the basement glass. A hand, a flicker of light, a sound that didn't belong. When the police dismissed his calls, he installed a hidden camera. What it captured changed everything. A boy locked away. Years of silence, fear, and a father's chilling control. But what no one expected was what the boy would say once the door finally opened. If you've ever wondered what goes unseen in the house next door, this story will stay with you. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that'll be released soon. Sycamore Street had a rhythm to it. Lawns mowed on Saturdays. Mailboxes repainted every spring. Porch lights switched on just before dusk. It wasn't the kind of place that welcomed disruption. Retirees walked their terriers in the early mornings. Children biked in careful circles near their driveways, and neighbors waved politely without asking too many questions. Every home had its habits, and every family its routines. All except the house at the end of the Col des Sacs. It wasn't abandoned, that much was clear. The grass never grew longer than 3 inches. The garbage bins were set out precisely on Tuesday mornings, then wheeled back in before the sun dipped. But no one ever saw it happen. The movements were quiet, discreet, always done in the gaps between moments when people looked away. A porch light flickered on each evening, but the porch itself remained bare. No chairs, no welcome mat, no holiday decorations. Just the faint scent of damp wood and the occasional squeak of its hinges in the wind. When the for sale sign had vanished months ago and the blinds inside snapped shut within days, people assumed someone had moved in, but they weren't. Sure, weeks passed without a glimpse. Curtains stayed closed through sunny afternoons. No cars came and went with any regularity. No voices drifted across the lawn. The mailbox was checked, but only at night. Packages disappeared from the doorstep without the sound of a door opening. It wasn't until Mrs. Linton, the retired librarian from 3 houses down, mentioned that a quiet man had introduced himself while picking up a prescription at the local pharmacy that the pieces began to take shape. She described him as mid-40s, pale, with neatly combed hair and clothes that looked pressed but slightly out of date. He didn't offer much, just said he was new to the area and had a son with medical needs. That seemed to satisfy her. After all, not everyone wanted to socialize. Still, she noted, there's something about his eyes. Like he's always half expecting a question he doesn't want to answer. The house had a small ramp leading to the front door, an ADA compliance edition, though no one remembered seeing a wheelchair. No delivery vans arrived with medical equipment. No therapists came and went. The ramp stayed clean, swept down weekly, but it was never used, at least not where anyone could see. A few kids in the neighborhood whispered among themselves. One claimed he'd seen a light flickering in the basement window late at night. Another said he'd heard tapping 3 sharp knocks like someone trying to get out, nodding. Their parents dismissed it as nonsense, bedtime stories made to spook each other. Still, some of those parents started pulling their blinds a little earlier than usual. Then came the new neighbor. He moved into the brick bungalow next door to the silent house, single, quiet, middle-aged. He drove an old sedan and brought boxes. In alone, people expected he'd keep to himself, like the last one did. But within days, he had repainted his shutters and set out potted plants on the porch. He nodded to the mail carrier, waved to the morning dog walkers. There was something calm and observant in the way he looked at things, like he saw what others overlooked. He noticed the patterns almost immediately. The house next door never turned on its upstairs lights. The blinds never moved. The ramp never creaked under weight. Yet he saw faint shadows behind the drawn curtains, silhouettes that didn't shift the way adults did. One night, he left a note, just a folded paper tucked under a rock near their shared fence. It said, "Hi, if you ever need anything, I'm next door." It was gone by morning, but no one responded. A week later, while adjusting his outdoor security camera to cover his driveway, he angled one slightly further toward the alley between the houses. It was a precaution, he told himself. The street was quiet, but not immune to porch theft. He didn't expect to see much, just shadows, squirrels, maybe raccoons. But that first night, as the camera clicked to infrared and scanned the motion-triggered zone, something moved in the lowest corner of the frame. A curtain lifted, not fully, just enough. Then it dropped. He rewound the footage 3 times. Behind the curtain, pressed to the glass, was a face, pale, wide-eyed, and impossibly still. It was just after 2:17 a.m. when the camera picked it up. A single flicker in the lower left corner of the screen, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. The neighbor wasn't. He was simply reviewing the footage to confirm the source of a sound he thought he'd heard earlier, a metallic creak like hinges under weight. It could have been wind, could have been a cat, or the wooden fence shifting in the cold. But then the flicker appeared again, and this time he paused. He zoomed. In the grainy black and white feed showed the side of the neighboring house. The camera had a wide angle, meant to monitor his own driveway, but the edge of the frame caught the narrow strip of wall between their homes. The basement window sat low, nearly ground level, mostly obscured by a row of old shrubs. It had never shown movement before, but now something had interrupted the light. A face, he thought. For only a moment, then gone. He rewound, frame by frame. At 2 hours, 17 minutes, and 42 seconds a.m. a shape emerged behind the glass, blurred, faint, colorless in the infrared. It didn't move naturally. It hovered, held still, then vanished. No mouth, no eyes, just the suggestion of a human head. He stared at the screen, unsure what to make of it. Shadows played tricks. Infrared, often distorted shapes. Still, he saved the clip and labeled it with the date and time. Then, unable to shake the unease, he walked to the kitchen and stared out the window, across the fence line to the neighbor's house. All dark, all still. The next morning, everything looked as it always did. The house wore its silence like armor. No curtains opened, no doors swung wide. The front yard was swept, the trash bins in order. Normal, as far as anyone could see. But something had shifted for him. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was instinct. A faint pull in his chest, the kind that told you something was off long before logic caught up. He didn't tell anyone. There wasn't anything to tell, just a flicker, just a feeling. That night, he adjusted the camera, gave it a sharper angle toward the basement window. Not obvious, nothing aggressive, but enough to capture more if it happened again. He also added a second camera to the back fence, camouflaged in an old birdhouse. It felt excessive, but he'd learned to trust that feeling. He'd felt it once before, years ago, in a different neighborhood, when he'd noticed bruises on a child who never spoke. He didn't act fast enough then. He wouldn't repeat that mistake. At 1:52 a.m., the motion alert chimed. He opened the feed in bed, expecting nothing. But there it was again. Not just a flicker this time. A hand, brief, pale, pressed to the inside of the glass. The fingers were spread wide, not waving, reaching. He held his breath. The camera wasn't strong enough to capture facial features, but the shape of the palm, the angle of the wrist, was unmistakably human. The hand trembled slightly, then pulled away. He sat up, pulse pounding. This wasn't imagination. Someone was down there. He waited 30 seconds. A minute, nothing else. The window returned to stillness, black behind the shrubs. He didn't sleep after that. He sat by the window with a thermos of coffee and a notepad, watching the house across the fence. No light came on. No footsteps echoed. But just before dawn, he thought he saw the curtain move just a few inches as if someone on the other side was watching back. By sunrise, the basement window was covered. Opaque plastic sheeting nailed into the frame. Quick work, hasty it. Hadn't been there the day before. That morning, he emailed himself the footage with a note. Second, confirmation. Possible child. Basement window, 1:52 a.m. He didn't know what exactly he had seen, but he knew what it wasn't. It wasn't wind. It wasn't a glitch, and it wasn't going away. It happened on a Tuesday. Late morning, the kind where the sun sat behind a veil of thin clouds, and everything looked a little desaturated. The kind of day where no one expected anything unusual to happen. The new neighbor was in the front yard, untangling the garden hose from a stubborn coil when the screen door of the house next door creaked open. He looked up. It was the man, the one from the house with the curtained windows and the basement shadows. The father stepped out slowly, as if testing the air. He wore a brown windbreaker zipped all the way up, despite the mild temperature. His hands stayed tucked in the pockets. His shoes were polished, oddly so, for someone who'd never been seen leaving the property. His hair was parted with exactness, like it had been combed and recombed until it stayed perfectly in place. There was a smile on his face, thin and practiced. "Morning," he called out, voice just loud enough to cross the fence line. Figured it was time I came over and said hello. The new neighbor straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Hey there, I was wondering if I'd get the chance to meet you." The man came no closer than the edge of his yard, maintaining a calculated distance. "I'm Graham Adler. I live here with my son." "Nice to meet you, Graham. I'm Mark." There was a pause, just long enough to feel awkward. Graham's smile held, but his eyes shifted, darted briefly, to the house, then to the ground, then back again. They didn't settle. He didn't. Ask Mark anything in return. No. What do you do? No. How are you settling in? Just silence, like he'd completed a required task and was unsure how to move past it. Mark tried again. "You've been here long." "6 years, Graham said quickly. "Moved in after my wife passed." "I'm sorry to hear that," Mark replied gently. "Tough thing." Graham gave a tight nod, but his expression didn't shift. "My son's got some health challenges. Keeps me busy." He glanced again toward the house, where the curtains remained firmly drawn. "We mostly keep to ourselves." "Totally understand," Mark said. "I've got no expectations. Just good to put a name to a face." Graham smiled again, more of a grimace this time. "People talk around here, not always kind." Mark raised an eyebrow. "I try to go off what I see." That made Graham pause. His hands twitched inside his jacket pockets. For a moment, the smile faded entirely. "And what do you see?" he asked. Mark didn't answer right away. The question had too much weight for something that sounded casual. He tilted his head. "Just a neighbor. Quiet house, that's all." Graham studied him. Something behind his eyes seemed to weigh that answer, turning it over for hidden meaning. Then, after a long moment, he gave a small nod. "Right? Well, welcome to Sycamore Street. You'll find it peaceful here if you keep to yourself." "Appreciate that," Mark said, watching as the man turned on his heel and walked back toward the house. He didn't linger, didn't make small talk, didn't ask if Mark needed anything or offer to lend a tool or recommend a local service. He moved with the caution of someone walking on a narrow beam, careful not to shift too far in either direction. As he reached the porch, he stopped and turned slightly. "My son doesn't like noise," he said over his shoulder. "Just so." Before Mark could respond, the door closed. The click of the lock was audible even from across the lawn. Mark stood still for a while, the hose forgotten in his hand. He hadn't missed the way Graham's eyes avoided direct contact, or how his voice never dipped into warmth. Every word, it felt like it was pulled through a filter, strained, controlled. It wasn't what Graham had said that unsettled Mark, it was what he hadn't. Mark didn't mean to see it. It wasn't snooping, not exactly. He was taking out the recycling just past dusk when a gust of wind blew through the narrow passage between the two houses, pulling Graham's side gate open with a loud creak. The latch must have been loose. Mark glanced up instinctively. Through the gap, he saw the basement door. It was flush with the ground, angled just slightly upward, the kind of sloped cellar entrance older houses had for bringing in coal or storing preserves. A pair of metal doors, painted over in the same dull gray as the siding, sat low and almost flush with the concrete. They would have been unremarkable if not for the gleam of steel near the handle, a heavy-duty padlock, thick. Industrial. Mark stopped. That type of door rarely needed a lock. Not like that. Most stayed sealed with a simple latch or nothing at all. The padlock was the kind you'd find on a storage unit or a construction site meant to keep people out or in. Before he could study it further, the gate creaked again, slowly swinging closed. He stood for a moment, bags of recycling in his hands, feeling the chill in the air creep up the back of his neck. He didn't go looking again that night, but he remembered. The next day, Graham didn't appear. No car in the drive, no movement from the windows. The curtains stayed drawn. Mark went about his errands, cleaned up some fallen branches in his yard, and reminded himself that he was just a neighbor, not an investigator. Still, the image stuck. The thick, deliberate lock, the type you only used when you didn't trust what was on the other side. That evening, it was quiet, windless, the kind of silence that draws attention to itself. Mark was in the living room with a book when it happened. A thud, not loud, but sharp, muffled, as if something had fallen against wood from the inside. He set the book down, listening. A second thud followed, lower, heavier, then nothing. He walked to the back window and looked across the fence. Graham's house sat in shadow. The porch light was on, casting a narrow beam across the yard. But the basement window, the one that had once shown a flicker of a face, was now fully covered with opaque plastic and what looked like nailed-in plywood. There was no light behind it, no sound now, just stillness. Mark waited 5 minutes. 10-0. He debated with himself, standing in the dark kitchen with one hand on the light switch. He wasn't imagining it. He knew the sound of an object falling. He knew what it was to hear movement inside walls that were supposed to hold still. And he knew to play that this wasn't just a creaky house. That night, he walked to the camera. Feed again, rewound it. Watched the infrared footage of the yard next door. At 10:41 p.m., a figure emerged from the back door of Graham's house. Graham himself. He kneeled, examined the padlock, then gave the doors a hard tug, testing their strength. Then he stood and walked a slow circle around the yard, scanning with the beam of his flashlight. His movements weren't frantic. They were measured, controlled. After several minutes, he returned inside, shutting the back door carefully behind him. Mark sat in the glow of his computer screen, unsettled. He downloaded the footage and labeled it. A habit now. He didn't know what exactly he was building, only that something was happening. Here and someone was trying to keep it quiet. Mark told himself it was about raccoons. That's what he said when he ordered the night vision camera online, and again when he signed for the package 2 days later. He'd seen the trash can knocked over twice in a week, and a neighbor's garden had been torn up the night before. Logical enough reason. Practical. Nothing strange about wanting to know what animal was rooting. Through his bins after dark, he installed it on a Saturday afternoon, fastening it to the edge of the porch roof where it had a clear view of the backyard and the alley between his home and Graham's. The motion sensor was sensitive, maybe to sensitive, but Mark figured he could adjust it later if needed. The camera had infrared and a decent resolution, enough to pick up heat signatures and movement clearly, even in total darkness. The first night, he forgot about it. He'd been tired from yard work and didn't think to check the feed until morning. The camera had triggered 8 times. Most around 1 a.m., he pulled up the footage on his laptop, sipping coffee as the sun came through the kitchen window. The first few clips were nothing, tree branches swaying, a neighborhood cat darting along, the fence line. Then, just past 2:30, the camera picked up something different. A dim glow from the edge of Graham's property near the basement entrance. Not a full light, not even a lamp, just the faintest pulse of movement, as if someone had turned on a flashlight. For only a second. Mark leaned in. The frame captured Graham again. The same stiff walk, the same jacket zipped to his neck. He appeared suddenly in the frame, as if he'd stepped out of complete darkness. His eyes didn't scan the yard like they had before. This time, he moved directly to the cellar door and crouched down. He didn't open it, just rested one hand on the padlock, staring at it. He stayed like that for nearly 4 minutes. Then, abruptly, he stood and left the frame. Mark replayed the clip twice. There was no visible reason for the visit. No sounds, no activity. Just a man standing in the dark, holding a lock, and then disappearing again by the 3rd day. Mark had adjusted the camera angle slightly, not to invade, but to monitor the shared fence line more fully. The camera didn't lie. It didn't suggest or assume. It simply recorded what happened, and what happened night after night was always quiet, always strange. The 4th night, the camera caught movement at 3:12 a.m., a single flicker again from the basement window, though now mostly obscured by the plywood. The motion alert triggered only for a moment. Mark played it back in slow speed. There was a shadow behind the window. It didn't move like a person walking past. It stayed. It shifted slightly, swaying in place. There was no light behind it, but the faint heat signature in the frame suggested something where someone stood. Just behind the glass dot, Mark sat back in his chair, heart drumming in his chest. He wasn't a person who jumped to conclusions. He believed in boundaries, in minding his own business. But the footage didn't feel like someone else's business anymore. It felt personal. That same night, he added a second camera, this one hidden deeper in his yard, disguised inside an old lantern on a shepherd's hook. It faced the side gate and the basement entrance more directly. He told himself it was still about the raccoons, that he was overreacting, but his gut told a different story. As he watched the feed tick by in grayscale silence, Mark realized he was no longer looking. For animals, he was waiting for proof that what he feared was true and that it wasn't just in his head. The first sound came just after 2 a.m., so faint Mark thought it was the house settling, a soft creak, like a board under weight. He paused the movie he'd fallen half asleep watching and sat up straighter, listening. Nothing followed at first, just the hum of the refrigerator, the distant thump of the water heater. He waited a full minute, then shook his head and went to shut off the lights. But as he reached for the switch in the kitchen, it came again low and muffled, but unmistakable. A voice, not loud, not clear, just enough to send a current through. The air Mark stood perfectly still, barely breathing, his fingers hovering just above the switch. He strained to hear, but the sound had already slipped back into silence. He stepped to the back window, careful not to knock over the stool nearby. The yard looked the same, still empty. A breeze rustled the hedges near the fence, but there was no movement beyond that. The camera's red light glowed softly above the porch. Recording, he didn't go back to bed. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and queued up the live feed. He turned the volume up, adjusting the sensitivity to capture the quietest ambient noise. For 15 minutes, there was nothing. Then, at 2:17, the static broke. A sound came through, soft and quivering. It was the kind of noise that forced you to question whether it was real. A whisper, barely more than a breath, filtered through the low-grade microphone. But Mark heard it. It repeated. Just one word, help. He froze. The volume was already high, but he boosted it again and leaned close, heart hammering. For several seconds, there was nothing. Then a different nose-dragging scrape, like metal against concrete. It came in bursts, slow, irregular, something being moved or pushed or pulled. Then another whisper, please. He rewound the footage, replaying the audio again and again. It was fragmented, unclear, but the rhythm, the pleading cadence was there. This wasn't a television or someone speaking through a vent. This was coming from outside. He muted the video and went to the back door, barefoot on the tile, and turned the lock with slow fingers. The air outside was cold and sharp, filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. He stepped onto the porch and listened. Every part of him strained toward the stillness. Then came the scraping again. Louder now, more deliberate. It was coming from Graham's yard, from the direction of the basement doors. Mark's breath fogged in front of him. He took a step forward, hand gripping the porch rail. There was no light on next door. The house remained dark, the basement window still blocked. But the noise-dragging metal repeated itself. He couldn't see the source, but he could hear it clearly now, rhythmic, desperate. Then a sudden thud. It echoed sharply, like something heavy had hit the inside of a door, then silence again. Mark didn't move for a long time. He stood there, arms tense, trying to understand what he was hearing, what it could be, and more pressingly, what it couldn't. A wild animal couldn't whisper. Pipes didn't beg for help, and no mechanical fault dragged itself across concrete. In patterns, eventually he went back inside and closed the door, locking it twice. That night, he didn't sleep. He watched the footage again, frame by frame, second by second. He clipped the audio and labeled the file, 2:17 a.m., voice metal impact. He didn't know what to do with it yet, didn't know who would believe him if he said what he heard, but he knew what he hadn't imagined, the sound of someone in the dark trying to be heard. Mark noticed it by accident. He wasn't watching the cameras that night, he was just sitting in his living room, a book half-read in his lap, letting the silence drift around him. It was well past midnight. The neighborhood had long gone to sleep, porches dark, blinds drawn, the occasional soft bark of a distant dog marking the only signs of life. He stood to refill his glass of water and, out of habit more than anything, looked toward the neighbor's house. That's when he saw it, a faint glow barely visible from the lowest window of Graham's home. The basement, the plywood that had covered it for weeks now, had a small section exposed near the top, just large enough to allow a sliver of light to escape. The bulb flickered, soft and uncertain, but it stayed on. Mark squinted through the dark. The rest of the house remained pitch black. No porch light, no kitchen glow, no movement behind curtains. Just that single bulb underground, flickering steadily like a weak pulse in the chest of something hidden. He set the glass down and went to the back window for a better angle. The camera would have caught it too, but Mark didn't want a recording. This time, he just wanted to see it for himself, unfiltered. The angle wasn't perfect, but it was enough. The glow was unmistakable now, a cold, bluish-white light, like something from an old utility room. Not warm, not comforting, just present. He stood there for nearly an hour, unmoving, waiting for the light to go out. Waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. No shadow passed, no figure appeared, no sounds, just the bulb, flickering every few seconds in a maddeningly inconsistent rhythm. At 1:34 a.m., he pulled up the live feed. The camera had captured it exactly an abrupt click of light in the darkness, timed like it had been turned on with intention. There was no motion to trigger it, no figure entering or leaving the frame, just darkness, and then glow. He fast-forwarded. The light never dimmed. It remained uninterrupted until well after 4. The next day, Mark walked past the house in daylight, slowly, as if heading toward the mailbox. He glanced casually toward the basement window. The plywood was still in place, now reinforced, with fresh screws along the edges. But up close, he could see what he hadn't before, rectangular hole near the top, about the size of a vent, barely wide enough for air or maybe light to escape. Someone had cut it deliberately. It wasn't. There before, Mark lingered for a moment longer than necessary, then walked back toward his own house. He didn't look behind him. He didn't want to see if someone was watching. That night, just after midnight, the light came on again. No delay, no warning. Just click, there it was. It stayed on for 3 hours. Never once did Mark see movement. Never once did a door open or close. But the light never flickered out on its own. It was always shut off manually without a sound. Over the next week, the pattern repeated. Some nights, the light stayed off completely. Others, it turned on past midnight and remained until nearly sunrise. Mark logged every instance. He recorded durations, timestamps, changes in brightness. But no matter how much he documented, he couldn't answer the one question that now consumed his thoughts. Why? What reason was there to keep a light on in a sealed basement at that hour? Who was it for? He knew Graham never left during the night. The cameras confirmed it. The man stayed inside, always alone, always quiet. And yet that light so small, so constant seemed to speak volumes in the silence. Mark sat in the dark one night, staring at the window, waiting for it to turn on. And when it finally did, at 12:42 a.m., he whispered to himself a question he hadn't said out loud before. Who are you keeping it on for? The grocery trips followed a schedule, always the same day. Always the same time, Thursday mornings at 9 a.m., give or take a few minutes. Mark had started noticing the pattern out of habit, more than intention. Graham's dark gray sedan would pull out of the driveway without hurry, without the engine ever revving too loudly. No radio playing, no passengers. It would return precisely 45 minutes later, trunk closed, windows up. Graham would get out alone, pop the back, and unload the bags in a slow, steady rhythm, not hurried, not rushed. Always the same cloth, bags thick-handled, branded from the local Coop 5 miles down the highway. Mark saw it from his kitchen window the first few times and thought nothing of it. Everyone had their routines. But after the 5th or 6th identical trip, he started paying closer attention. The number of bags never changed. For large ones, 2 per hand, sometimes a 5th balanced against his hip. Mark began to wonder about the contents. Fresh vegetables, packaged goods, milk for a man and a son with medical needs. As Graham had once vaguely put it, the groceries seemed sparse, too little, or too regular. It didn't add up. Even more unsettling was what didn't follow. Mark never saw a trash bag carried out, never saw empty cartons, boxers, packaging. No overflowing bins, no blue recycling container wheeled to the curb. In a neighborhood where every house put out their waste like clockwork, Graham's corner lot stayed silent. The bin sat empty week after week, and no lid was ever lifted. One morning, Mark made a quiet note to himself. Watch for what leaves. The house. He watched for 9 days. Nothing did. The bags went in. Nothing ever came out. He noticed the same apples visible in the kitchen window 5, in a bowl on the counter, never eaten, never rearranged. The same milk carton glimpsed once. Through a slightly parted curtain, still in the same position 3 days later. It didn't make sense the first time Mark caught it on camera. It was a minor detail, Graham carrying in the bags and setting them just inside the door, then closing it behind him without taking off his jacket. 40 minutes later, the same. Bags reappeared emptied of content, but were placed neatly back into the trunk. It was the only time Mark saw them leave the house. He replayed the footage twice to be sure. The timestamp confirmed it. The cloth bags went in full and returned empty, as if the groceries had never been meant for the refrigerator or pantry at all. Just a prop. A performance. Mark began to doubt what he thought he understood. Maybe Graham had a second fridge in the basement. Maybe he composted. Maybe he recycled discreetly. But those were weak explanations, and even his own mind didn't believe them. The next week, Mark checked his own trash bins before bed and noticed something. Someone had lifted the lid of his recycling container and closed it again without leaving anything. Just a quick check, as if looking for something, or making sure nothing was left behind. He turned to the camera feed again. The movement was, there too, 14 a.m., a shadow in his side yard just beyond the fence. Someone had walked up the drive, gloved hand on the bin, and then vanished before the camera could capture more than a shape. Mark didn't sleep that night. He sat in the kitchen, curtains drawn, lights off, just listening. He knew what routines looked like. He knew how normal people went about life, messy, imperfect, filled with evidence of living. But Graham's house gave nothing. No clutter, no wrappers, no smells of cooking drifting from the open windows in the evening. Only silence. A home that absorbed groceries like a sponge and offered no proof that anyone inside was actually eating, drinking, or discarding anything. At all, it was a closed loop. Things went in, nothing came out, and somehow that felt more frightening than any sound he'd heard in the night. The basket wasn't elaborate. Mark had filled it with modest things, locally made preserves, a small loaf of sourdough from the farmer's market, some wrapped herbal soaps. He didn't even include a card, just a folded note tucked under the handle that read, "Welcome to the neighborhood, Mark next door." Nothing personal, nothing intrusive. It was the sort of gesture people used to make before fences grew taller and eye contact became rare. He rehearsed how he'd say it. Too, just wanted to say hello. Or maybe figured it was time I brought this over. Casual, friendly, but not too forward. Still, even as he walked the few steps up the neighbor's path, he felt a weight in his stomach. It wasn't fear, exactly, more a kind of anticipation, like stepping onto ice that might hold or might not. He knocked twice on the front door. No doorbell. The sound echoed oddly in the stillness of the porch. He waited. The basket rested in his hands. Then he remembered. There was no answer. He knocked again. This time, a shadow passed behind the frosted glass window beside the door. A second later, the sound of a lock turning. Then another, and another. 3 total. When the door opened, it was only by 2 inches. Graham's face appeared in the one eye and the upper half of his mouth. The chain was still hooked, tight against the frame. Mark smiled gently. "Hey, I brought something for you and your son." "Just a small, we're private people," Graham said, cutting him off. His voice was low but firm, like the conversation had already gone on longer than it should have. There was no sign of the son, no sound from inside, just the faint smell of dust, maybe old paper, maybe mildew. Mark hesitated. "Sure, I understand. I just thought, I appreciate the gesture," Graham interrupted, his mouth stiff. "But we don't do visitors." Mark shifted the basket slightly in his hands. "It's nothing personal, just being neighborly. Figured I'd try." Graham didn't respond immediately. His eye remained fixed, unblinking. Then, without moving his head, he said, "You watch things, don't you?" The question caught Mark off guard. "I'm sorry, your cameras," Graham clarified. "You have them pointed this way." Mark kept his tone level. "They're just for security. A few break-ins down the block a while ago." Graham nodded. Slowly, people like to watch, even when they don't understand what they're seeing. There was no accusation in his voice, but the words felt sharp all the same. The chain rattled slightly as Graham adjusted his weight. Mark swallowed. "I'm not trying to intrude, just wanted to offer a small kindness. That's all." The eye behind the door narrowed, as if testing the truth of that statement. Then, with the faintest of sighs, Graham said, "We manage fine." He started to close the door. Mark raised the basket slightly. "Would you like me to leave this here? Or—" "No need," Graham said flatly. "Really." And then the door shut. The locks turned again. 1, 2, 3. Mark stood for a moment, still holding the untouched gift, listening to the echo of his own breath. He stepped back from the porch and walked slowly down the path, the gravel crunching beneath his shoes. He left the basket at his own door instead, setting it gently on the kitchen table. He didn't touch it again that day. Something about the encounter lingered longer than it should have, the way Graham had spoken calm but guarded. The way he'd known about the cameras, and most of all, the quiet behind the door. Not the kind of quiet that happens when someone's asleep or busy or resting. It was the kind of silence that pressed against the walls, heavy. Absolute Mark made a note in his journal that night. Not long, just a single line. Visit denied. Door opened 2 inches. Nothing behind him, not even a light. The houses on Sycamore Street were old enough to share quirks. Mark's had uneven floors in the hallway and a stubborn second-floor window that stuck every summer. And as he came to learn that winter, the heating vents carried sound more efficiently than they should have. It wasn't something he noticed when the neighborhood was quiet. But one cold night in late January, while adjusting the thermostat in his upstairs hallway, he heard something that made him freeze mid-dash step. It was faint, barely there. Not a voice, not words, but something human. He leaned closer to the vent, one hand bracing against the wall. The floor creaked under his weight, but he ignored it. The sound came again, a low tremor, like air pushed through trembling lungs. Not speech, not movement. A cry, not the sharp wail of injury or panic. It was something more controlled, worn down. It sounded like it had been going on for a long time. Mark stood in place for over a minute, trying not to breathe too loudly. His ear hovered near the metal grate, the warmth from the vent barely noticeable through the cold that settled in his chest. The crying continued, steady, rhythmic, not muffled by distance, but by barriers, walls, floors, perhaps an old air duct, connecting the homes from a time when they shared more than property lines. He pulled back slowly and stared at the vent. It hadn't made noise like that before, not once in the months he'd lived there. Not until tonight. He walked to the guest room, which sat adjacent to the side of Graham's house, and checked that vent too. This one was older, tucked high along the wall near the ceiling. He had to drag a chair over and stand carefully too. Listen. Again, the same sound. Quiet, but closer now. Still not speech, just the intermittent rise and fall of breath wrapped in grief. He stepped down and sat on the bed, heart heavy in his chest. There were too many possibilities, and only one that made sense. It didn't belong to Graham. The pitch was wrong. Softer, smaller. It wasn't an adult's voice. And there was only supposed to be one other person living in that house. Mark didn't sleep that night. He paced quietly, rechecking the vent twice more. But the crying had faded after an hour. Not stopped, faded, as if someone had grown too tired to keep going. The next morning, he checked his camera logs. No movement. No signs of activity. Graham's car never left. No deliveries. No visitors. Later that day, as the sky grayed with approaching snow, Mark stood on the side of his house and examined the bricks, the shared wall, the narrow crawl space between structures. The rusted old utility access points places he hadn't paid attention to before. It was clear now that the sounds weren't imagination. They were carried through metal and wood, whispering through vents that hadn't transmitted anything for decades. That night, the crying returned. This time, it came earlier. Just past midnight, Mark didn't press his ear to the wall. He didn't need to. He could hear it from the hallway as he passed the closed guest room door. A sound so quiet and so continuous that it felt like part of the house's very structure. He sat on the floor just outside the room, knees pulled up, and listened. The crying never escalated. It never turned into sobs. It just stayed there, like a thin thread running through the vent weak but unbroken. Mark didn't reach for his phone. He didn't call anyone, not yet. Instead, he whispered into the silence, not expecting a response. "I hear you." No reply came. Only the steady hum of grief drifting through the ductwork, reminding him of everything he didn't know and everything he was no longer willing to ignore. It was mid-afternoon when Mark saw it too late in the day for shadows to play tricks, too early for streetlights to interfere. He hadn't meant to look, but the motion sensor had pinged on his camera app while he was cleaning dishes. Most alerts turned out to be wind or squirrels darting across the yard, but this one caught his eye because it came from a new angle. The side camera, the one near the overgrown hedge that separated his yard from Graham's, had picked up something. Unfamiliar, he dried his hands on a towel and walked to the window first, peering out across the narrow strip between the houses. The sun was low and cold, throwing long beams across the fence line. Everything looked still. But then the alert buzzed again. Movement. He turned to his phone, opened the app, and scrubbed back 10 seconds on the playback. There, just at the edge of the frame, he paused it and tapped to zoom dot between the thick hedges. Through the gap near the basement door, something metallic caught the light for less than a second. A circular shape, silver, thin spokes radiating from the center. It was angled strangely tilted, not upright. Next to it, a horizontal bar, smooth and black, with chipped paint along the edge. Another shape behind it, but blocked by a shadow. That swallowed the details whole. A wheelchair. Mark stared at the screen, frozen. It wasn't a full view, just a glimpse of flash of metal framed by shrubs and poor lighting, but unmistakable. The type of wheelchair you'd find in a hospital or long-term care facility. Not a lightweight mobility chair, but the older, heavier kind meant to be used indoors. Built for someone who didn't leave often, he backed up the footage again, watching frame by frame. It appeared only for 2 seconds. The wheel glinted. The bar caught the light. Then it was going to roll backward into shadow, swallowed again by the edge of the house and the dark entryway leading to the basement. He pulled up earlier clips from the day. No one had gone in, no one had come out. Graham's car was still parked, no deliveries, no visitors, just that single, sudden appearance. Like someone had pushed the chair into the doorway and then pulled it back. He stood by the window for nearly 20 minutes afterward, watching. The yard remained still. The basement entrance stayed closed. There were no sounds, no voices, just the knowledge, now hard certain, that someone down there required a wheelchair. Someone who hadn't been seen. Someone whose presence was only hinted at through grainy footage and the flicker of movement behind plywood. Mark tried to tell himself it was possible, that maybe Graham's son had needed the chair after a recent injury, that maybe this was new. But that logic unraveled. Quickly, the ramps, the reinforced gate, the crying through Vincit had all been there before the chair appeared. This wasn't new. What was new was that someone had made a mistake. They'd let the edge of that chair cross the threshold into view, if only for a moment. A single wheel, a glint of steel, had breached the carefully maintained curtain Graham had drawn around his home. Mark didn't sleep that night. He sat in the dark with the image paused on his screen. A wheel frozen mid-turn, the rest lost to shadow. Did they know someone next door had seen them? Did they want to be seen? At 3:42 a.m., the basement light flicked on again. Mark didn't check the camera feed. He just stood at his window and whispered, almost without thinking, "I saw you." And the light stayed on until morning. Mark noticed the changes gradually, though once he pieced them together, the timeline felt deliberate, calculated down to the hour. It began with the gate. The narrow wooden one between the two houses had always been slightly ajar, not broken, just weathered, the latch barely held on windy days. Mark had walked by it countless times on his way to the garden shed, sometimes nudging it back into place without thinking. But one morning, the gate was different. Reinforced, a new bolt had been installed, heavy and black, drilled into both the gate and the adjoining post. The slats were reinforced with metal strip-welded plates screwed directly into the frame over the aging wood. Mark stood there with a rake in his hand, staring at the newly secured entrance like it had appeared overnight. It hadn't, but the transformation had been quiet, efficient. No sounds of hammers, no clatter of tools, and yet it was unmistakably new. He moved closer. The chain that now wrapped around the bolt was too thick for a standard gate, the kind used for industrial yards or padlocked shipping containers. At the end hung a combination lock, matte black, the kind that didn't come cheap. He tested the gate gently. It didn't budge. Mark took a step back, his eyes tracing the length of the fence line. The hedges on his side had always given just enough room to peer through the cracks if someone were curious enough to look. But now even that felt like it had been accounted for. Fresh branches cut from somewhere else had been woven through the wooden slats. Green, dense, strategic dot. Later that afternoon, Mark checked the basement window, the one visible from his upstairs guest room. It had always been covered with plywood, but there had been gaps. Slits at the top where light could escape, where sound, on some nights, had crept through in soft, aching waves. Now, it was covered entirely. A new sheet of black adhesive film had been applied across the visible portion of the glass, tight against the pane. No more light seeped through. No more accidental glimpses of movement. The plywood remained, but now sealed tighter with additional nails, smaller but driven in at closer intervals, like someone had taken the time to ensure not even the wind could lift an edge. Mark stood in the guest room and stared down at the sealed window. It wasn't an attempt at insulation. It wasn't for privacy in the ordinary sense. This wasn't about keeping people out. It was about keeping something in. He sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, hands resting on his knees, a weight pressed into his chest, the kind that didn't come from paranoia or theory, but from the realization that someone was actively, meticulously removing every point of visibility, every access, every vulnerability. The wheel had been seen, the crying had been heard, and now those channels were being closed one by one. Mark turned on the camera feed and watched the footage from the last few nights in reverse. The film had gone up sometime between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m., during a stretch of time where the motion sensors had triggered but caught only Graham's shadow moving across the yard, tools in hand, a flashlight beam, the glint of something metallic, and then darkness. He sat there watching it over and over, trying to ignore the quiet unease blooming inside him. It was no longer just odd behavior, no longer strange noises or flickering lights. It was action, deliberate, defensive, hiding. And Mark was no longer certain. He was only watching. He had the uneasy sense that somewhere, behind one of those windows, someone knew exactly what he'd seen, and they were starting to build walls between him and the truth, brick by careful brick. He wrote a single line in his notebook that night, underlined twice. He's sealing it shut. It was a gray morning, the kind where the sky never quite commits to rain, but hangs heavy with the threat of it. Mark stood by his window with a mug of coffee in hand, half watching the street, while trying not to think about the night before. The vent had been quiet, generally sonde. The basement light hadn't turned on at all. That silence had settled in his chest, like a weight. It was almost worse than the crying. At least the crying proved someone was still there. At 10:13 a.m., a white van pulled up in front of Graham's house. No markings, just a sliding side door, and a driver in a dark windbreaker who didn't look around much. He stepped out with a large cardboard box, double-taped, and marked with a red sticker that Mark could just make out. Temperature sensitive, medical contents. Mark set down his mug. The man didn't ring the bell. He didn't knock. He placed the box on the porch, took a photo with his phone, and left without a word. The whole process took less than 40 seconds. The van rolled away without a glance, toward the other houses. Mark waited. Usually Graham took his time, bringing things in. He rarely opened the door within minutes, but today, the door creaked open just 90 seconds after the van had pulled. Away, Graham appeared in the doorway, wearing gloves, thin latex ones that caught the light with a slight sheen. He looked quickly to the left, then the right, then stepped outside and crouched over the package. He didn't lift it immediately. First, he examined it. He turned it slightly, checked each side. He reached into his jacket and pulled out what looked like a box cutter. With careful movements, he sliced the tape, peeled it open, and looked inside. Mark watched from the kitchen window, heart tapping a little faster. Graham reached in and removed a sealed bag-clear plastic with tubes, curled neatly inside, and something else, square and blue. Ice packs. There were labels on the tubes, white stickers with barcodes, no branding, no instructions visible. Then he moved quicker. He took the entire package, now opened, and pressed it against his chest like a bundle. He turned back into the house, closing the door without locking it behind him, which was unusual. Mark moved to his back window, glancing toward the shared fence. Nothing stirred on the other side. He checked his camera feed. The side angle had caught everything: the arrival, the hurried retrieval, the bag of tubing and cooling packs, and the urgency with which Graham had handled it all. Medical supplies. Mark sat down at his desk and rewound the footage, playing it back frame by frame. The red sticker stood out clearly. He took a screenshot and enlarged it. Deliver to occupant only. Refrigeration required. Handle with care. He searched the barcode on the package, typed it into every public tracking site he could find. Nothing. It wasn't a standard parcel service. The delivery wasn't logged by any commercial courier. No FedEx UPS, USPS, no tracking trail at all. Whoever had sent it used a private, likely medical-only distributor, and Graham had been expecting it. That explained something. The groceries that never left the house. The lack of trash. The stillness. He wasn't shopping for food, he was managing something clinical, something controlled, possibly secret. Mark opened his journal and flipped to the page where he'd begun logging. Deliveries. There had been only 2 before this. One padded envelope placed directly into the mailbox, and one small box Graham had taken inside late at night. Both had arrived without fanfare. No labels, no return addresses. But this package was different. It was specific, regulated, urgent, and someone had trusted Graham enough to send it directly to his door. Mark stared out the window as the sky darkened a shade. His own reflection faint in the glass. Behind the curtain next door, a figure might have been moving, he couldn't be sure. Behind locked doors and blackened windows, someone needed medical supplies delivered in silence. And no one, not family, not friends, not the state, seemed to know. It appeared just after dawn. A single balloon, pale blue, and already beginning to sag, tied loosely to the metal hinge of the side gate. Mark noticed it when he went to take out the recycling. The balloon bobbed slightly in the wind. Tangled once around the hinge, the knot tight but hurried. There was no card, no sign of festivity, just the quiet presence of that gesture, left without context. Mark stood for a moment at the edge of his driveway, trash bag in one hand, watching the balloon flutter. The morning was still, with a light mist clinging to the grass. Nothing about the house next door had changed. The curtains were still drawn, the basement window still covered. No sounds, no light. Yet there it was, this delicate contradiction, soft and round and impossibly out of place. He checked the time. 7:04 a.m. The neighborhood hadn't woken yet. No cars passed, no other signs of life, just that pale balloon swaying against the gray slats of the gate, catching the early light in its shiny plastic skin. By noon, the balloon had twisted on its string. The knot had slipped slightly lower down the post, and its color looked faded. Mark watched it from his upstairs window while pretending to tidy the guest room. A breeze had picked up, and with every gust, the balloon bumped gently against the wood with a hollow tapping sound. He scanned his camera footage from earlier. There was no delivery, no visitor caught tying it there. Whatever had happened, it had taken place during the blind hours between camera triggers. In that murky space, where minutes go unnoticed, someone from within the house had placed it. There was no other explanation. By 3 o'clock, Mark had grown restless. He walked past the fence again, slower this time, pretending to rake leaves that didn't need raking. He looked for clues, a discarded wrapper, a ribbon, anything that might tell him why the balloon was there. There was nothing. And then, just after dusk, it was gone. He didn't see it taken down. No one passed by, no alert on the motion sensor. But when he returned from folding laundry at 6:45 p.m., it had vanished. Not popped, not deflated, removed, cleanly, quietly. The knot was still there, though. A short, frayed piece of string, cut unevenly, the end slightly curled from tension, as if someone had pulled hard for a second before slicing it free. That night, Mark sat in the living room with the lights off, the curtains slightly parted, and watched the side yard. No visitors came, no cars pulled up, but around 9:10 p.m., the basement light flicked on. He counted the minutes. It stayed lit for exactly 22 minutes. Then darkness returned. Mark didn't write much in his notebook that evening, just a single date, underlined. March 2nd, someone's birthday. There had been no music, no laughter, no cake, no voices, no signs of celebration, just one forgotten balloon, tied in secrecy, removed before anyone could ask about it, as if the day was too dangerous to acknowledge for long. He lay awake wondering what it had meant, who the balloon was for, if the person it was meant to honor had even seen it, if they knew it had been there, or if, like so many other things in that house, it had been offered in silence and erased before it left a mark. By morning, even the string had blown loose from the hinge. There was nothing left to suggest the day had ever been different, just the same locked gate, the same darkened windows, and one more piece of evidence that something human to exist in a place built entirely to suppress it. It was nearing midnight when Mark finally gave in to the sense that something had shifted. The night was unusually still, the kind that made every creak in the floorboards sound deliberate. His cameras had sent no alerts, yet he felt drawn to check the footage, not out of paranoia, but out of rhythm. He had grown used to reviewing it like a nightly ritual, not expecting discovery, just needing to look. He sat at his desk, lit only by the blue glow of his monitor, and pulled up the side camera first. Nothing but the motion of tree branches swaying, blurred by low resolution and street lamp light. Then the front camera Graham's car parked in its usual spot, unmoved, untouched. No packages, no visitors. He clicked through each clip manually, moving backward, checking the intervals between triggers. Then he opened the feed from the rear angle, the one facing the back corner of Graham's house. It was positioned more out of curiosity than practicality. From that angle, most of what it saw was the top half of the basement window, the one with the black film and plywood. The camera had triggered once, time-stamped at 9:58 p.m., and then again at 10:01, only 3 minutes apart, too short for wildlife, too long for wind. He opened the clip dot at first. It looked like a glitch, just a dim shift in tone across the window. But then, frame by frame, it became unmistakable. A shape moved behind the glass. It was slow, unsteady, like something was dragging itself toward the window from within. The plywood didn't cover everything. There was a small rectangular section left bare near the top pane, and it was in that square that the movement became visible. A hunched figure appeared, just the outline, not sharp, not defined, but real. Something crouched low, close to the ground, casting a soft shadow through the black film as it moved behind the pane. It paused, then rose slightly. Mark leaned closer. The shape steadied, adjusted, and then a hand. The faint silhouette of fingers spread flat against the glass. It was a right hand, slightly splayed, each digit pressing forward. There was no detail, just the shift in tone where skin met glass, filtered through the dark film. But it was enough. Mark froze, eyes locked on the screen. The hand didn't move for nearly 15 seconds. It just held there, unmoving, as if whoever it belonged to wasn't sure they were being seen or perhaps didn't care. Then it slipped downward, trailing across the pane, and the figure sank out of view. He replayed the footage twice, each time confirming what he had seen. It wasn't Graham. The shape was too small, too slight. It was someone else. Someone who had made their way to the window after weeks of being hidden behind locked doors and sealed vents. Mark copied the clip, saved it to a separate folder, and labeled it Window Contact, March 3rd. His hands trembled slightly as he typed. He hadn't realized how tightly he'd been gripping the mouse. Outside, the night remained still. He returned to the window and looked out toward the house next door. The basement light had not come on. There was no indication that anything had happened, but he knew what he'd seen. Someone had come to that window, not to escape, not to signal, but just to press a hand against Etaz, if needing to feel the barrier for themselves. As if that touch was the only gesture they had left, Mark sat in silence. For nearly an hour after that, the image of the hand lingering in his mind, not reaching, not pounding, just resting there, patient and resigned. And somewhere in the dark, behind glass and plywood, someone waited, not for rescue, not for noise, but simply for proof that they were not alone. The storm arrived without much warning. By the time Mark looked up from his laptop, the sky had already gone the color of bruised slate. The clouds were thick, rolling low and fast over the tops of the houses, and the air outside had taken on that strange heaviness kind that made the hairs on your arms rise before the first drop ever fell. He shut the window just as the wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the fence. It began with light rain, then thunder, a low distant growl that moved closer with each passing minute. The trees bent and swayed, and the first bolt of lightning, cracked across the sky like a snapped wire. Lights flickered in the kitchen. Then again, Mark reached instinctively for a flashlight he kept under the sink at exactly 9:07 p.m. The power went out. The house went silent. He sat still, listening. In the darkness, every sound magnified: rain on the roof, wind pressing against the walls. But beneath it all, from somewhere beyond his own backyard, something new had broken through it. Sudden burst of noise from the house next door. It wasn't the creak of floorboards or the hum of a generator. It was shouting, not words, but the urgent shape of them raised voices tangled together, a clash of something raw and sharp. A heavy crash followed, like furniture tipping or something metal hitting the ground. Then a cry. Mark held his breath, straining to separate the storm from the human sounds underneath it. The cry came again, louder this time, a sound that didn't belong to wind or thunder. It was guttural, desperate, not accidental. He stepped carefully toward the window, pulled the curtain aside, and tried to see through the rain. It was dark. Only the distant glow of backup lights from a few houses down provided any illumination. But the house across the fence was pitch black, and yet it was alive with sound. The noise didn't come in one steady wave. It came in flashes, broken by silence. A door slammed. Something scraped against the floor. Then what sounded like a panicked voice, frantic, garbled through the distance, but unmistakably human. Mark moved to the guest room and opened his camera app. But without power, the feed was dead. His battery backup had failed. He was blind. He pressed his ear against the glass, heart pounding, trying to make sense of the chaos. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. No crash, no voice, no scraping. The house across the fence went still, not just quiet but hollow, like whatever had filled it moments before had been erased. Mark stood in the dark, waiting for another sound, another sign. None came. Only the steady drumming of rain and the occasional rumble of thunder. At 9:23 p.m., the power returned. Lights blinked on around the block. Street lamps buzzed softly back to life. Inside his home, the refrigerator hummed. Clocks reset. The normalcy of electricity restored, everything except the feeling in Mark's gut. He glanced back toward Graham's house, still dark. Not a single light had come back on. He watched for several more minutes. No flicker in the windows, no movement, no sound. Whatever had erupted inside during the outage had vanished the moment power returned. He sat down and wrote only one sentence in his notebook that night. Whatever is happening in that house needs the dark to breathe. And across the fence, behind the sealed basement window, someone waited once more in silence. It happened on a Thursday morning, just past 10. The sun had broken through the clouds for the first time all week, casting long shadows across the wet sidewalks. Mark was trimming the overgrown ivy along his fence when he noticed a woman approaching the house next door. She was dressed plainly tan slacks, navy cardigan, messenger bag over one shoulder, and a clipboard in hand. Her shoes were sensible. Her walk was brisk, but not rushed. She didn't look like a neighbor or a relative. She looked official. Mark stayed where he was. Shears paused mid-snip, watching as she stepped up to Graham's door. She knocked twice, firmly, not loudly. Then again, after a pause, she shifted her clipboard under her arm and took a pen from her pocket. Something about the way she waited professional but uneasy told Mark this wasn't a routine visit. After a moment, the door opened just wide enough for Graham to appear. He didn't step outside. His hand stayed on the inside knob. He was wearing the same gray sweatshirt he always did, frayed at the sleeves. From Mark's angle, he could only see part of Graham's face, but it was clear his smile didn't reach his eyes. The woman introduced herself, voice soft but audible over the wind. Mark couldn't make out the full conversation, but he caught enough: follow-up, home environment, documentation. Her tone was practiced, rehearsed, a cadence that had been used dozens of times before. Graham's reply was clipped, but not impolite. He leaned into the doorframe slightly, body language both assertive and defensive. He nodded a few times, occasionally gesturing inside with a thumb. The social worker held her ground for a while, asking something. Again, Mark caught the words, entry and inspection. That's when Graham's tone shifted. Still quiet, but firmer now. Less cordial. He shook his head. Repeated something. raised his hand a little, not threateningly, but enough to suggest finality. The woman glanced down at her clipboard, made a small note, then returned the pen to her pocket. She looked up once more, said something with a practiced smile. Then, turned, she was back on the sidewalk in under 3 minutes. Mark watched her walk away, her shoes clicking softly on the pavement. She didn't pause at the gate, didn't glance back, just kept walking, toward her Cara Silver sedan parked half a block down. No calls, no photos, just a quick note on the clipboard and gone. It didn't sit right. Mark went inside and sat at his desk, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. A social worker didn't typically leave that quickly, not without at least seeing the inside, not without speaking to whoever else might be living there. He opened his notebook and jotted down the time, her description, and the duration of the visit. Later that afternoon, he pulled up public records and checked the county's Department of Child and Family Services. Their site listed standard procedures. For home welfare checks, if a minor or vulnerable person was believed to be present, the expectation was visual confirmation, entry or at least observable evidence of living conditions. A 3-minute chat at the door didn't qualify. Mark rewatched his exterior camera footage. The woman arrived at 10:06 a.m. She left by 10:09. No attempt was made to go around the back, no second knock, no follow-up attempt inside Graham's house, no lights turned on, no shadows passed by the windows. It was as if the visit never happened. Mark considered calling the agency, but he didn't know her name. He didn't have a badge number, just a vague time stamp and a sinking feeling that someone who was supposed to care had let something slip right through. He wrote another line beneath the time. Log in his notebook, gatekeeper answered. No one looked past him. And in the house next door, the door stayed shut and the silence returned. It came just after 3 a.m, the kind of hour when even the wind sounds tired, and the world has shrunk to nothing but shadows and the soft thrum of appliances. Mark had been up later than usual, unable to sleep, the glow of his computer screen flickering against the walls as he scrolled through old camera footage, trying to piece together patterns that didn't quite connect. He had just poured a glass of water and was heading back toward the bedroom when he heard it, a sound so thin at first, so swallowed by distance, that he almost thought he imagined it. It wasn't the wind, that he knew instantly. He froze, listening. It came again, higher this time, a sharp inhale caught in the throat. Not an animal, not an echo. It was distinctly human, the sound of someone trying not to cry and failing. Mark put his glass down without realizing it. The house was still, but he could feel the sound in his chest. He crossed quickly to the back window, peeled the curtain just enough to look toward the neighboring house. Darkness. The windows were black, the backyard still, but the sound had come from there, he was certain. He moved to the desk, pulling up the live camera feed. The rear camera hadn't triggered, but he scrubbed backward anyway, checking each frame around the timestamp. Nothing moved, but on the audio there it was, a small spike. He isolated the clip, turned up the volume, and played it again. A soft, stifled sob. It wasn't long, barely for seconds, but it was raw. A choked breath between cries, a wet inhale, and then silence. Mark played it again and again. It sounded like someone trying to stay quiet, someone muffling their mouth with a hand, not the loud sob of someone seeking help, the opposite. The sound of pain that had learned how to hide. He leaned in closer, listening frame by frame. There was something else after the sob, a faint scraping, like fingernails brushing across fabric or floor, and then nothing. He sat back in his chair, staring at the waveform, fingers hovering above the keyboard. It wasn't the first time he'd heard something strange from that house, but this was different. This wasn't a thud or a distant voice. This was intimate, immediate, and it sounded like a child, not a grown man. Not Graham. Mark saved the audio, labeled it by date and time, and looped it again through his speakers. The more he listened, the more undeniable it became. It wasn't anger. It wasn't a tantrum. It was grief. It was fear. He glanced toward the notebook on his desk, already crowded with timelines and note sightings, sounds, deliveries. He flipped to a fresh page and wrote one line. March 16th, 3:12 a.m. Cry, young human, trying not to be heard. He sat there for a long time, staring into the dark space beyond his window, trying to picture the room behind the basement wall, who was down there, what they looked like, how long they'd been practicing silence, and what finally, in that moment, had broken them enough to let the sound out. By dawn, the cry had stopped echoing, but Mark couldn't stop hearing it. It followed him into the kitchen, into the shower, into every room of his house, because he hadn't imagined it, and he knew whoever had made that sound was still there, still behind that wall, still hoping that no one had heard. Mark didn't expect to find anything new that morning. He'd reviewed so many hours of footage that each scene blurred into the next shadows, shifting, trees swaying, porch lights blinking on and off. But something made him rewind a little. Further than usual, it had rained overnight. He knew the motion sensors often triggered in weather like that, but this clip was different. The timestamp read 4:41 a.m. He clicked play. At first, it was quiet. The camera faced the side of Graham's house, angled just enough to catch the narrow patch of concrete that led to the basement entrance and old storm. Cellar-style door tucked beneath the deck stairs. It was rarely used, usually locked, always still. But on the grainy footage, Mark saw movement. A figure stepped into frame. Graham. His posture was hunched, his gait deliberate. He held something in his right hand, a keychain, faintly visible as it glinted under the distant floodlight from Mark's shed. He approached the basement door slowly, looking over his shoulder once, then again. The camera had no audio from that angle, but Mark leaned closer anyway, as if listening might somehow make the picture clearer. Graham knelt by the hatch and fumbled with the lock. It took him longer than expected. His shoulders shifted, arms moving with a frustrated jerk. After nearly 20 seconds, he succeeded. The door creaked open, not visible directly, but its swing cast a new angle of light onto the concrete. The basement was dark, but not entirely. A dim yellow glow flickered from within. A bulb, likely. Then, the door remained open. Graham stood still. He didn't descend. He just waited, and that's when Mark saw it. A hand, small, pale, emerging slowly from the darkness just behind the threshold. It didn't grasp. It didn't wave. It merely appeared, resting against the frame, thin fingers, unmoving, braced. Against the edge of the door, a tremor passed through it, subtle but visible even in low resolution. Mark's breath caught. He paused the video. It was not the hand of a grown man. It was frail. The skin nearly translucent in the camera's infrared mode. There were no sleeves, just a bare arm and part of a wrist. Then, after a long pause, the hand retreated. Slowly, as though afraid, Graham didn't flinch. He didn't move toward the figure. He simply stood until the hand disappeared, then reached forward and shut the basement door. The lock clicked again, and he walked away. Mark sat frozen, watching the footage on loop. Every frame confirmed what he had begun to suspect. Someone was alive down there, someone who hadn't seen daylight in months. Someone reaching, even briefly, toward the only opening they were ever given. He rewound again, frame by frame. The motion of the hand, the way it hovered, unsure, then withdrew. It wasn't just retreat, it was practiced, conditioned. Whoever was behind that door had learned when not to cross thresholds. Mark downloaded the clip, burned it to a flash drive, and placed it beside the growing folder of evidence he had been too hesitant to act on. But this was different. This was not just a sound, not just suspicion. It was physical proof. He wrote in his notebook. March 17th, 4:41 a.m. visual. Basement door opened. Child's hand visible. Denied exit. He looked out the window, across the fence. Graham's house was as still as ever. The curtains drawn, no cars coming or going, no lights. But the memory of that hand stayed with him, not for what it did, but for what it didn't dare do. It reached, and then it retreated. Mark waited until the evening to make the call. He'd rehearsed it all day, pacing in circles around the living room, gripping the flash drive in his hand. He didn't want to be dramatic. He didn't want to accuse anyone without evidence. But the image of that pale hand retreating into darkness wouldn't leave him. He played the footage again before dialing Jess to remind himself it was real. The officer arrived just after sunset, headlights sweeping across the driveway before he stepped out. A middle-aged man, weary in posture, uniform neat but unbothered. He introduced himself as Officer Reeds, nodding toward Mark's open front door. Mark invited him inside, gesturing toward the desk where his monitor still showed a paused frame. Of the hand on the basement door, Mark explained everything carefully. The odd noises, the crying in the night, the grocery bags that never seemed to be thrown away, the failed social worker visit, the basement window that had once shown movement before being blacked out. Then, the footage. He played the 4:41 a.m. clip in full, twice. He didn't speak as it played, just let the images speak for themselves. The officer leaned in, hands on hips, face neutral. That's a child's hand. You can see the size. And the father, he's clearly locking him down there. Reeds glanced back at the screen. You sure it's a child? I'm sure it's not Graham. That's not a grown man's hand. The officer straightened and looked around the room, as if checking for some other problem he might address instead. Then he sighed and pulled out a small notepad. Look, he said, writing slowly, you've clearly seen some strange stuff. I'm not saying you're wrong, but the guy next door, Graham, he's listed as the boy's legal guardian. There's already a case file. Mark blinked. You know about him? We've had calls before. A few wellness checks. The kid's got some kind of disability, from what I was told. Nonverbal autism, maybe. No signs of abuse noted at the time. Social. Worker left it open. No red flags. No red flags. You just watched him lock a kid in the basement. Reeds rubbed the back of his neck, eyes flicking to the footage again. That door could lead to a finished basement, could be a bedroom. We don't have audio. You don't see a face. It's circumstantial, it's imprisonment. Reeds let out a tired exhale. You want my honest take? Unless we catch something clearer, a scream, something indisputable, this doesn't rise to forced entry or intervention. Not unless we've got cause, and guardians have the right to decide how their dependents are cared for. Within reason, Mark stared at him. So what now? I'll write up a report, Reeds replied, tucking his notepad away. I'll file it under welfare concern. It'll go back to family services. Maybe they'll follow up, maybe not. But without a direct complaint from inside that house or physical evidence of abuse, there's not much more we can do. He offered a shrug that felt like the closing of a door. Mark followed him to the porch. The night air was cool, the sound of cicadas buzzing in the trees. Reeds tipped his hat slightly and stepped off the porch. Heading back to the car, Mark watched the taillights disappear down the street. No sirens, no backup, just silence. Inside, he wrote in his notebook, March 18th, filed report. Officer Reeds, no action. Guardian status cited. He sat at the desk for hours afterward, the same frame still paused on his screen. That hand, that retreat. That brief moment where someone reached into the world only to be pulled back by a system that shrugged nothing. Had changed dot, except now he knew no one else was coming. It was early morning when Mark found it. The grass was still wet with dew, and the sun hadn't yet burned off the mist that settled low over the fences. He had stepped into his backyard with a mug of coffee in hand, still wearing slippers, ready for nothing more than quiet, but something at the base of the wooden fence caught his Aja piece of paper, curled at the edges, clinging damply to a weed by the corner post. At first, he assumed it was trash, maybe a receipt that blew over from the recycling bins, but when he bent to pick it up, the way it had been folded 3 times carefully made him pause. It wasn't just litter. Someone had placed it there. Deliberately, Mark unfolded it slowly, the paper soft from moisture, but still intact. The writing was in pencil, uneven and pressed too hard. Like it had been written without a desk, maybe on the floor or the wall. The letters were all lowercase. The edges were torn. 4 words. He keeps me here. Mark didn't move for several seconds. The paper trembled slightly in his fingers. There was no signature, no date, just the message, scratched like a breath that had finally broken the surface. His first instinct was disbelief. Could it be a prank? A cruel joke? But the placement, the folding, the scrawled handwriting didn't feel manufactured. It felt desperate, rushed, as if someone had risked something just to get that paper over the fence. He turned toward the house next door. Graham's yard was empty, as usual, the curtains still drawn, the basement windows still covered. But the note in Mark's hand felt like a voice, one that had been trying to reach out for weeks, maybe longer. One that had finally found a way. Past the lock, he went inside, placed the note flat on the dining table, and snapped a photo with his phone. Then he slipped on real shoes and walked the perimeter of the backyard, checking the fence line. There was only one place where the boards had a gap, large enough to pass something through low and near the vines where the ground sloped, just wide enough for a small hand to push paper through unnoticed. Mark crouched beside it. There were scratches on the bottom plank, faint, but there, like small fingernails, had scraped the wood repeatedly. Not new, but not old either. He stood up slowly, his chest tight, inside again. He added a new entry in the notebook. March 19th, note found. At 7:14 a.m., written on torn lined paper. For words, he keeps me here. Origin, almost certainly from neighboring basement. Matched to hand seen on footage 3/17, he didn't know what to do next. He had already filed a report. He had shown video. He had presented the facts. And now he had a note, but notes didn't scream. Notes didn't break doors or force official action. They could be dismissed, misinterpreted, lost. Still, he knew what it meant. It meant someone was still trying, still hoping. He scanned the note and attached it to an email. This time he sent it directly to the Family Services caseworker listed. In the public registry, subject line, urgent follow-up, basement welfare concern, new evidence. He attached the footage, the audio, the image of the note. Then he clicked send. He kept the paper on the table, waited under a small glass bowl like something fragile that might disappear if left alone. Across the fence, the house remained quiet, but the silence no longer felt passive. It felt watchful, as if someone had noticed the absence of a piece of paper, as if someone was waiting to see what would happen now, and Mark, more than ever, felt that the fence between the two houses was no longer just wood. It was a line between seen and unseen, free and trapped, heard and ignored. And someone, barely visible, had finally whispered across it. Mark wasn't looking for anything when he stepped into the corner grocery store that afternoon. He just needed milk, maybe eggs. It had been a restless kind of day-gray sky. No wind, too quiet. He hadn't slept much the night before, stuck in loops of imagined rescue plans and unread emails to the local agency. The note from the fence still sat on his kitchen table, weighted by a coaster now instead of a bowl. But the words remained unchanged, impossible to ignore. He keeps me here. He walked through the sliding doors of Langley's Market and was met with the usual hum refrigerators. Murmured conversation, the soft beep of a scanner at checkout. He made his way toward the dairy aisle, head low, just trying to focus on the simplicity of a list. Then he heard it, a voice he recognized, type-clipped, rising in frustration. Graham. Mark looked up instinctively, scanning the front of the store. There, near Register 3, stood the man he'd watched for weeks through security cameras and half-closed blinds. He was dressed the same as always, gray sweatshirt, faded jeans, but his posture was tense. One hand gestured angrily, while the other clutched a plastic grocery basket. Across from him stood a young store clerk, trying to remain calm, holding a small handheld scanner and looking more confused than confrontational. "It says the card's inactive," the clerk said, voice low but firm. "I just used it 3 days ago," Graham replied, louder. "There's money on it. Try it again." Mark stepped behind a display of apples, keeping a safe distance but watching carefully. He could see inside Graham's basket canned soup, powdered milk, a box of adult nutritional drinks, no fresh produce, no snacks, no children's food. Just long shelf items and things that didn't require much chewing. The clerk tried the card again, glanced at the screen, then shook his head. Graham swore under his breath. "You people always find a way to mess this up. We don't control the card," the clerk said. "You might need to call the number on the back. I don't have time for that." There was a pause, and then Graham reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded wad of bills, crumpled, damp-looking. He peeled off a few and slammed them on the counter. "Just ring it up." The clerk did as he was told, though Mark could see the discomfort on his face. It was a small store. Everyone heard everything. When the transaction was done, Graham grabbed the bag, muttered something unintelligible, and left without waiting for a receipt. Mark watched the door swing shut behind him. It wasn't just the confrontation that stood out, it was the absence. There was no one with him, no child, no wheelchair, no evidence of the person Mark had seen through the basement window or heard crying in the dark. Mark walked to the counter after a moment, choosing a different register, pretending to browse the gum selection while listening to the clerk vent. To a colleague, "He comes in once a week," the young man said. "Always acts like he's doing us a favor. Same stuff every time, like survival food. Never talks to anyone." The colleague shrugged. "Creeps me out. Just pay and go, you know?" Mark paid for his milk and walked out slowly, eyes scanning the lot. Graham's car was already gone. Back at home, Mark opened his notebook and wrote, "March 20th, 3:42 p.m., spotted at Langley's Market. Argued over food stamp card, paid cash, no child present, basket, canned goods, meal replacements, no fresh food." He stared at the note for a long time, then glanced again at the paper on his table. The one with 4 scrawled words, "He keeps me here, not feeds me, not cares for me, keeps dot," and there, in the sterile calm of a local market, Mark saw just how icily someone could disappear in plain sight. Mark sat in front of his computer long after the sun had gone down. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of wood settling. He hadn't touched his dinner. The footage played again on his screen, the grainy clip of the basement door opening, the pale hand reaching out, the slow retreat. He had watched it so many times, the motion no longer startled him. But the weight of it, the meaning behind that moment, hadn't dulled. He opened a browser and navigated to a public forum. He'd visited once or twice before, a site dedicated to anonymous neighborhood reports and citizen surveillance. It was mostly filled with mundane concerns, loose dogs, porch pirates, odd smells from backyard grills, but occasionally there were threads that mattered, stories that didn't make it to the authorities but still needed to be seen. He created a new account with a name that didn't matter. No identifying email, no location tags. He uploaded the video, trimmed to a 30-second clip, and titled the post simply, "Basement Door." 4:41 a.m., something feels wrong. In the body of the post, he wrote, "Neighbor across the fence has had strange behavior for months. Screams. At night, no one seen entering or exiting, child's hand visible in this clip. I've reported it, nothing's been done." He says he's the legal guardian. "I'm posting this because I'm out of options. Someone needs to see it." He hit post and waited. At first, nothing. Then a few views, a few comments. Could be a finished basement. Doesn't look like abuse to me, but yeah, weird. Following, let us know if you see more. Then, a private message appeared. From a user named Jules Advocate, the profile marked with a small badge indicating verified community role. The message was short. "This isn't the first report. Can we talk?" Mark hesitated, then clicked reply. They moved the conversation to a secure thread. Jules introduced herself as a disability rights advocate, former caseworker, now an independent investigator for families with vulnerable dependents. She didn't ask for Mark's name, she didn't press for his location, but she asked about the footage, about the hand. About the note, Mark typed out everything, what he'd seen, what he'd heard, the report that went nowhere, the grocery store confrontation, the whispers through the vents, the visitor with a clipboard who left too fast. He even sent a scanned image of the note from the fence. Jules responded quickly. "The supplies, the behavior, the hidden spaces. This matches patterns we've seen before. We've had 2 prior inquiries about that household. Both were dropped after brief welfare checks, but something tells me they weren't thorough." Mark's pulse quickened. He asked, "Do you know who the boy is?" Another pause. Then, "I believe so. His name might be Adam. Diagnosed at age 3. Severe autism, nonverbal. Removed from school system at 7 after father claimed homeschooling. No documentation since. That was 3 years ago." Mark leaned back in his chair. 3 years. No records, no sightings, no school, no services. Just a locked basement and a man who moved groceries like he was feeding a ghost. Jules continued, "You did the right thing posting this. I have contacts in protective services that don't go through the usual chain. I'm going to push this forward quietly, but I need you to stay alert. If anything changes, I need to know immediately." Mark nodded, then typed, "I will. I'm not letting this go." They ended the conversation after an hour. He closed the laptop, sat in the dark with the soft glow of the street lamp filtering through his curtains. For the first time in weeks, he felt something shift, not hope exactly, but traction. He walked to the back window and looked out across the fence. The house was dark, silent, but Mark wasn't just watching anymore. He wasn't alone. Somewhere out there, someone else knew. Someone else finally believed him. Mark visited the school on a rainy Thursday morning under the pretense of volunteering for a community reading program. He had parked 3 blocks away, not wanting to draw attention. The building was old but clean, its red bricks darkened by the drizzle. Banners along the fence read "Support every child and every voice matters." That last one stuck with him. Inside, the front office smelled like laminate and pencil shavings. A receptionist greeted him kindly, asked him to sign in, handed him a visitor badge. Mark nodded along, making note of names on doors, framed student artwork. Hallway plaques. When the principal stepped out, Mark made his approach. Her name was Mrs. Halpern, mid-50s, short silver hair, sharp but warm eyes. He introduced himself, used the reading volunteer excuse again, then pivoted gently. "There's a student I used to mentor years back. Family lived just down the road from me. The boy's name was Adam. Might have been Adam Miller or Adam Graham. I was hoping to maybe reconnect, just to check how he's doing. I think he would have been enrolled here about 3 years ago." The principal furrowed her brow slightly. "I've been here a while. Let me check." She stepped into a side room and returned a few minutes later, holding a slim paper folder. "We did have an Adam Graham. Enrolled in the 5th grade? Let's see." Mark watched as she flipped through attendance logs and report cards. Her expression shifted as she read, "He had an IEP individualized education plan, significant support services, behavioral therapy, assisted speech sessions, but odd." She tapped the page, says he was withdrawn mid-year. No medical records, no transfer request, just a handwritten note. Moving, out of district, homeschooling, dated and signed. By the father, no documentation filed with the district, Mark asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Technically legal," she said, not hiding her skepticism, "but not ideal." Level of support. Normally, there's a process, a home evaluation, state reporting. This, it's like he just vanished. Mark nodded slowly, taking in each word. Was there ever a follow-up? She shook her head. "Unless there's a truancy issue." Mark asked if he could see any of the records. Even if he's no longer enrolled, we're bound to privacy laws. But if you're concerned for his well-being, you can submit a statement. I can forward it to the district. Inside, he wrote everything down. March 21st, 10:08 a.m. Adam Graham. Enrolled 3 years ago at Langley Middle School, 5th grade. EIP, in place, withdrawn mid-year. Stated reason, homeschooling. No follow-up, no transfer. Services terminated abruptly. A boy who once had access to speech therapy, aids, modified curriculum, suddenly pulled out without goodbye. Without anyone noticing, he never came back, not missing, just erased. He opened his laptop and typed a message to Jules, confirmed Adam Graham, Langley, Middle School. Jules responded minutes later. "I'll escalate this. I know someone at the State Oversight Office. This might be the opening we need," Mark replied simply. "Keep me updated." Then he walked back to the kitchen, looked through the rain-streaked window toward the neighboring house. Still dark, still silent, but now he had something new. Proof that the world had once seen Adam, known him, educated him, and then, like so many others, simply looked away. It was a little after 8 a.m. when the car pulled up, gray, quiet, unmarked. Not the kind of vehicle that drew attention. No logos, no official seals, just a late-model sedan with tinted windows and a steady idle. It parked across the street. Not directly in front of Graham's house, but close enough to see the front door clearly. Mark noticed it because he was watching. He had been since sunrise. Coffee growing cold on the WINDOWSILL. The driver's door opened. A woman stepped out, early 40s, dressed in a dark coat with a tablet tucked under one arm. Not police. Not a social worker, by appearance. But her movements were practiced. Observant, she looked up at Graham's house, studied the windows, then stepped to the sidewalk and crossed with purpose. Mark leaned slightly to the side, behind the curtain, careful, not to move too fast. From his vantage point, he could see that she paused at the mailbox, glanced at the address, then moved up the front path. She knocked twice, firm but not aggressive. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the door cracked open. just a few inches. As always, Mark recognized the silhouette behind it. Graham's stance was familiar, now shoulders turned, voice low. Head tilted just enough to make eye contact without fully showing his face. The conversation was too far away to hear clearly, but the woman's posture didn't shift. She spoke calmly, occasionally tapping her tablet, occasionally holding something card perhaps, or a printed document. She pointed once toward the side of the house, gesturing in a way that indicated she wasn't there on a guess. She had a reason, she had a name. Mark watched the door close slowly, not slammed, but not welcoming either. Then nothing for a long minute. The woman didn't leave. She stood on the step, checking her device, then rang the bell again. This time the door opened wider. Graham appeared more fully now, still blocking the entrance with his frame. He spoke with sharper gestures. One hand moved across his chest, the universal sign for, "That's not your business." His mouth moved quickly, too quickly to be friendly. The woman didn't flinch. She nodded once, typed something onto the tablet, then spoke again longer this time. Mark could see the father's shoulders tense, then drop slightly. He said something short in response, then stepped back into the house. Closing the door behind him, another long pause. Then finally the door opened again. Wider, Mark single quotes his breath. Caught, the woman entered. Only for a moment, less than 3 minutes passed. Then she exited the house alone, walking back toward the sidewalk with a neutral expression. She didn't look frustrated. She didn't look satisfied, just unreadable. As she crossed the street again, Mark backed away from the window. He didn't want to be seen. He watched from a corner now, just enough to glimpse her getting into the car and opening a laptop across the center console. She typed something quickly, then pulled away without fanfare. The entire exchange had taken less than 15 minutes. Mark stood in the quiet afterward, wondering what had been said, what had been shown, and whether it would matter. Later that afternoon, he messaged Jules. Someone came, state investigator maybe. She went inside. Not long. Left without incident. Jules responded, "I escalated the file yesterday. That was likely from the Office of Protective Oversight. Good sign. I'll try to get the visit summary." Mark didn't respond right away. He walked out to the yard, stood near the fence, and looked again at the house next door. Same curtains, same silence, but for the first time someone official had crossed the threshold. And for those 3 minutes, the locked door had been opened. It was the kind of morning Mark used to ignore. Birds out early, air still damp from the night before, sunlight filtering through the narrow gap between the two houses. But ever since he'd installed the hidden camera on the corner of his shed, just enough to catch the basement windows and the rear side gate, he'd developed a habit. Every morning, before breakfast, before email, before anything else, he checked the footage. Most days, it was nothing. A squirrel, a trash bag rustling, shadows moving with the wind. But not that morning. The notification had arrived. Just after 6:12 a.m., motion detected, duration 2:14. He clicked play. The camera feed sprang to life, colors oversaturated in the early sun. At first, the scene showed nothing unusual, the back of Graham's house. The narrow concrete strip leading to the side basement entrance. The faint hum of morning birds, distant traffic, someone dragging a hose across pavement 2 houses down. Then movement. The basement door flew open hard, bouncing off the frame. Graham stepped out first, wearing his usual frayed sweatshirt, hair wild, movements jerky. His expression wasn't visible too far, too grainy, but his body was tight, purposeful. Then the second figure appeared. Mark paused the video. The frame showed 2 legs, thin, pale, not fully steady. One foot dragged slightly, the other planted. Cautiously, the boy's body followed small, hunched arms curled inward. He wore a thin t-shirt and oversized sweatpants that dragged on the ground. Mark pressed play. Again, Graham grabbed the boy by the arm. Not gently, not guiding, yanking. The boy stumbled. One shoe came loose and fell behind. He reached for it, slow and unsure, but Graham pulled against this, time harder. The boy fell forward, his knees scraping the concrete, his hands slapped flat. To catch himself, no sound came through yet, but the image was enough. The awkward tension of it, the shape of someone trying not to cry, then came the yelling. The microphone on the camera crackled to life, catching just enough. Graham's voice, rough and low. Get up now. Stop acting like this. The boy tried. His hand reached for the wall to steady himself, but he couldn't quite get his legs under him. Graham turned sharply, dragged the boy again, pulling him several feet toward the base of the fence, where a blue bucket and garden hose sat unused. The boy's hand grazed the pavement. Mark saw a smudge of blood on the concrete. The boy didn't resist. He didn't scream. He simply looked forward, his mouth open slightly, eyes vacant. A kind of stillness that didn't come from calm but from knowing resistance had no place here. The camera's microphone caught something else, a sound, not from the boy, but from Graham. A grunt, a slap, then static. The audio dropped, the video feed continued, but the sound was gone. The camera glitched for 3 seconds, then resumed. Silent. Mark watched the final 10 seconds of the clip. Graham marched the boy back toward the basement door. He opened it with one hand, the other still locked on the boy's arm. The boy turned, slightly just before crossing the threshold, his face briefly visible. Mark paused again. The boy's lips moved. Not speech, more like a silent breath, a half-formed sound that never made it through the wires. Then the door closed. Mark sat in. The silence of his living room, the air around him, thick with something he couldn't name. He replayed the clip once. Twice, he copied it to a new folder, labeled it, and backed it up to an external drive. Then he opened his messaging app and sent a note to Jules. New footage, daylight, clear, physical handling, audio partially lost, but visual is solid. You need to see it. He attached the file, hit send, and then, for the first time, he opened his browser and searched for local attorneys. Not because he was suing anyone, but because it was time to know the full extent of what he could do, of what protection looked like, not just for Adam, but for himself, because the camera didn't just see it. Now others would too. It happened just before dawn, but no one in the neighborhood slept through it. The flashing red and blue lit up every window along Sycamore Street, flickering against curtains and blinds like lightning on a clear morning. The silence of pre-sunrise, ours was shattered by the unmistakable sound of engines, boots, and voices barking orders. Mark had known it was coming. Jules had messaged him the night before with one line, "It's happening, stay inside." He didn't sleep. He sat by the window, lights off, watching the street as if he were waiting for a storm to roll in. At 5:42 a.m., the convoy arrived: 2 police cruisers, an unmarked black SUV, and a larger van with state identifiers barely visible under layers of dust. Officers moved with precision, their uniforms marked with protective services and child welfare divisions. No sirens, but the urgency was clear. They didn't knock. 2 officers broke from the group and moved toward the front of Graham's house. A third circled toward the back, flashlight in hand. Within seconds, the front door was breached. The sound wood splintering, metal wrenching echoed up and down the block. Dogs barked. Lights flicked on in neighboring homes. People peeked, from upstairs windows, from porches, from cracks in their fences. Mark didn't move from his spot. He watched as the father was pulled from the doorway barefoot, shouting in a voice so hoarse it barely registered. He was shirtless, arms flailing, trying to explain something or perhaps deny everything. It didn't matter. The officers moved fast. They pressed him against the wall, cuffed his wrists behind his back, and led him down the steps without hesitation. His face was twisted, not just in anger, but in disbelief, as if the world he had controlled so tightly had turned on him in an instant. Mark's eyes drifted back to the basement door. It took longer. Officers paused, there 2 of them, speaking, quietly, keys in hand. They tried the lock first. It didn't budge. Then came the bolt cutters. One quick snap, and the chain dropped to the concrete with a hollow clang. The door creaked open. Mark held his breath. From his vantage point, he could only see a sliver of what lay beyond. But the flashlight beams told the story. They moved slowly. Down the stairs, illuminating pale walls streaked with mildew and grime. The air that rose up was heavy, unclean, as if the basement hadn't breathed fresh oxygen in years. Then the first voice called out, "Got him, he's here." Movement accelerated. A medic appeared, then another. A stretcher was wheeled from the van and brought toward the rear entrance. Mark strained to see Dot. It took nearly 5 minutes before the boy emerged. They carried him gently, bundled in a blanket, too large for his frame. He didn't resist. His arms were thin, his skin ashen. He blinked slowly, eyes darting from face to face, not with fear, but with disorientation. Light, noise, movement, all unfamiliar. One hand clutched something small, a strip of fabric, perhaps a torn piece of the same blanket he'd always used. No one tried to take it from him. The medics spoke in low tones. One gently adjusted his oxygen tube. Another wrote, "Down vitals." The boy Adam was placed on the stretcher and loaded into the ambulance. The doors closed, the sirens didn't wail. They didn't need to. Mark watched until the van pulled away. The house next door stood open now, the front door unhinged, the basement unlocked. A team in white suits entered soon after, beginning what would become a full forensic sweep. Photographs, measurements, bagged evidence. They moved like archivists through a forgotten ruin. Later that day, news vans would arrive, reporters would speculate. Neighbors would gather in clusters, whispering versions of the story they thought they understood. But Mark stayed inside. He sat quietly at the table, hands folded, heart still pounding. It was over. Or, at least, the part where Adam was hidden was over. For the first time in years, someone had opened that door and not looked away. The hospital room was too quiet for the machines it held. No beeping, no bustle of nurses. Just the soft whoosh of the oxygen line and the subtle creak of vinyl as the boy shifted in his bed. They had placed him in a pediatric recovery suite. Though he was older than most patients, there his body small for his age, his frame curled inward like someone used to taking up as little space as possible. Mark stood just inside the doorway, unsure if he should step closer. A nurse had led him there after some coaxing. Jules had cleared it, said it might help. "He's been asking," she'd said, but not with words. Adam sat propped up with pillows, one arm wrapped tightly around a folded blanket, not hospital issue. It was the same scrap of blue fleece he'd been holding when they lifted him from the basement. He wouldn't let it go. His eyes were open now, clearer than they had been the day before. They followed Mark as he entered. Mark moved slowly, taking a seat near the window, just far enough not to intrude. The boy watched him the entire time. No fear, no retreat, just quiet observation, a kind of study. Mark didn't speak at first. The doctors had said not to rush it, that he might not talk. That verbal language might have faded in the years of silence. So Mark waited. Minutes passed. A nurse came in briefly, checked vitals, adjusted the IV. Adam didn't react. When she left, the room returned to stillness. Then, without turning his head, Adam moved his lips. It was barely a sound. More breath than voice. Mark leaned forward slightly. What was that? A rasp. Window. Mark followed his gaze. You want it open? Adam nodded once. Slow, deliberate. Mark stood, crossed to the window, and opened it just an inch. Cool afternoon air drifted in, carrying the scent of trees and distant traffic. He turned back. Adam's fingers tightened around the blanket. His eyes never left Mark. Another pause, then he spoke again. 2 words this time. You saw. Mark sat again, gently. Thought no one would. Mark let the silence hold for a moment. I'm sorry it took so long, he said. Adam didn't respond right away. He studied Mark's face, as if trying to match it to the camera lens he must have seen once, perhaps, that night when he reached toward the glass. Unsure who might be watching. Finally, he whispered again. I waited, every night. Throat tightened. He nodded. You shouldn't have had to. The boy looked toward the door, then back at Mark. Is he gone? Yes, Mark said, voice steady. He can't come back. Adam stared at the ceiling then, as if trying to believe it. As if the absence of chains, locks, and dark silence still felt too thin to trust. He spoke once more, and this time his voice didn't shake. Don't let them forget me. Mark's response was quiet. I won't. The nurse re-entered then, gently reminding Mark that visiting time was short. He stood slowly, unsure how to leave. Adam simply nodded once, a small gesture of acknowledgement. Not goodbye, just, I see you. Mark stepped into the hallway, heart heavy but certain. The boy had spoken, and the world would not be silent again. But the kind that said, this is worse than you think. She didn't linger. just placed the file on Mark's kitchen table and stepped back, waiting in silence as he opened it. Inside, the language was clinical, detached, observations stacked in bullet point summaries. No emotion, no commentary, just the raw inventory of years spent in a space no child should have survived. Mark read slowly. Age 14. Weight, 71 pounds. Height, 4 in BMI. Critically underweight. Muscle mass deteriorated. Vitamin D deficiency. Consistent with long-term lack of sunlight. His knees bore the imprint of constant contact with cold concrete. His spine showed evidence of long-term malpositioning. Marked cold. Injuries documented in clinical succession. Healing abrasions along the forearms, consistent with repeated dragging. Bruises in various stages of discolorations, some fresh, some weeks old, others barely fading. 2 partially healed fractures in the left wrist. A dislocated finger that had been manually reset without medical attention. Scarring on the upper arms, consistent with pressure restraint or bindings. Skin lesions caused by prolonged exposure to damp surfaces, and yet no sign of permanent. Neurological damage, no developmental disorder, as once rumored. Different tone, almost as if the physician had dropped the mask for a moment. It noted the boy was mentally present, alert, cognitively intact. He had full awareness of self and others. He remembered everything, everything that word repeated in Mark's head long after he'd folded the report shut. He remembers everything. Later that evening, Jules confirmed it. He's lucid. He knows the date, the president, the street he lived on. He even remembers what shows he used to watch before the door was locked. Mark asked the question quietly. And his father? Does he talk about him? Jules hesitated. Only when asked, and even then, he speaks plainly. Not with fear, with facts. He made me eat on the floor. He didn't like when I asked for more water. I could hear the television upstairs. She paused. He doesn't cry when he says it, but his hands clench every time. Mark looked away. The details sat in his chest like stones. Jules continued. Names of classmates, teachers. He had favorite subjects. He told me he missed science the most. Mark closed his eyes for a moment. He should have been in high school. By now, should have, Jules said. We've had 2 educational evaluators come through already. They think he can catch up within a year. Mark nodded, but said nothing. The house across the fence was still dark. Less frequently now, the curiosity had died down, replaced with a strange kind of guilt. No one spoke about what happened anymore, but the silence was too recent, too raw to be comforting. The report stayed on the kitchen table that night. Mark didn't file it away. He left it there as a reminder of what had happened, of what had been seen, and of the boy who had survived all. Of it aware, alert, and still holding on to the full weight of memory. The morning was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. No sirens, no reporters, no movement on the sidewalk beyond the usual jogger and the neighbor's dog doing its rounds. But something had shifted. Mark noticed it when he stepped into his backyard, with a mug in hand, scanning the line where his property met Graham's. The old fence still stood worn, faded, but no longer bearing the weight of secrecy. The house next door looked different now. Subtle at first, the overgrowth had been cleared. From the back wall, revealing the structure in full for the first time in years. The side gate no longer bore the heavy lock. The basement door stood ajar, just slightly, enough to prove it no longer held anything prisoner. But it was the window that made Mark pause. That window had been blacked out for so long. No one remembered what kind of glass it had. The covering, some mix of dark film and nailed plywood, was gone. For the first time, sunlight poured through it, clear and sharp, and behind that glass sat a wheelchair. It wasn't hospital issued. It looked used, familiar, a bit worn along the handrails, but it was positioned deliberately, not tucked into a corner or abandoned near the door. The chair sat directly in front of the basement window, angled slightly upward, as if placed there with intention, so whoever sat in it could see the sky. The curtain rods still hung above, but the fabric was gone. Nothing obscured the view now. The room behind the window was being cleaned, Mark could tell by the faint hum of a vacuum and the scent of antiseptic drifting through the air. Workers in light uniforms moved in and out, one carrying a fresh mattress, another adjusting overhead lighting. Mark didn't know who made the decision to keep the basement window clear. but he understood it. Later that day, he walked the sidewalk. In front of the house, not spying, not inspecting, just passing, as neighbors do, through the window, he caught a glimpse. Adam, seated in the chair, a blanket over his knees, the same blue fleece he wouldn't let go of in the hospital. A nurse stood nearby, adjusting something on a side tray, but Adam's gaze wasn't on her. His eyes were fixed upward, toward the sky, following the light as it moved across the grass and touched the siding of houses down the block. Mark slowed for just a moment. He didn't knock, he didn't wave, but the boy turned his head slightly. Their eyes met through the glass. There was no fear in Adam's face now, no confusion, just stillness, a calm that hadn't been there before, a posture of someone not used to being seen. Now, quietly reclaiming the act of looking back, Mark nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Adam nodded too. That night, Mark sat on his porch, long after the sun went down. The basement light across the fence stayed on. Not the harsh bulb that once buzzed through the night, but a softer one, warm-toned, intentional. The house no longer whispered. It didn't rattle, it didn't hide, and the boy who had waited so long in darkness now sat by the window facing. Daylight, watching the world, returned to him one beam at a time.